I've spent most of my adult life wandering places where people don't normally go. It started off in graduate school, a geoscience program that sent me deep into the Nevada wilderness, sometimes for even weeks at a time. I'd be out there all alone, just me and my gear, in the expanse of empty land stretching on forever and ever. It was my job to assess mineral deposits, conduct soil analysis, and occasionally I'd have to mark sites for geological interest for private firms and state organizations. That work took me into places so untouched, I could count on one hand how many human footprints had crossed them in a century. And when you're out in that kind of isolation, you start to find things. Old rusted cans from prospectors 100 years dead, wreckage from planes that had gone down in the 40s, still half buried in the dirt. Sometimes bones even, mostly animals, but not always. I'd come across abandoned mining camps, eerie rock formations that looked too intentional to be natural, and once, a single boot, so sun-bleached it was almost white, still standing upright as if the owner had just stepped right out of it. The strangest discoveries, though, were the signs of people. Not travelers, not hikers, people actually living out there. I encountered my first mountain people while on a research trip near the Jarbidge Wilderness. I'd been hiking along this dry wash when I spotted smoke threading into the sky, I'd say around a mile ahead of me. I thought maybe it was some kind of illegal dump site, but as I got closer, I saw them. 3 figures standing near this sagging cabin, dressed in mismatched layers of clothing, their faces shadowed under these wide-brim hats. They all stood motionless as I approached, watching. I lifted a hand and gave a nod. I didn't get anything back. I turned and walked the other way, just kind of learned to look the other way when you encounter these things out here. And that was my first encounter, but not my last. Most of the time, these off-grid people just wanted to be left alone. Other times, they weren't so friendly. And the story I'm about to share with you is one of those times. I was crossing this ravine, making my way up the ridge when I saw a cabin. At first, I really thought it might have been an illusion, a trick of the light, but no, it was indeed real. Perched on the far side of the ridge, it looked ancient, a relic of time when people had the kind of guts it took to live all the way out here. I could see the dilapidated roof, the walls sagging with age. The wood was even grayed by the sun, cracked by the harsh winds. It hadn't been touched in years, decades even. I stopped to take it all in, a bit stunned and taken aback. In all my years working in remote places, I'd never found anything like this. No trails, no signs of recent life, and I'd walked this way before. I figured it was indeed that, a relic, something abandoned long ago by whoever tried to make a life out here. I'll admit I was half tempted to explore, to see what kind of remnants I could find inside, but I was here for another reason: mineral deposits, veins of granite and quartz. I had a job to do. I pulled out my handheld metal detector and started scanning the ground, my mind now focused back to my work. The air was dry and thin, the sky stretching like a canvas, empty except for the occasional hawk soaring above me. It was one of those moments when time seemed to slow down and the world seemed to vanish around you, just me in the dirt underneath my boots. And that's when I noticed something moving. At first, I barely even noticed it, a flash of motion at the cabin. I blinked and looked again. A figure. Too far to make out clearly, but a man maybe? His movements were slow and mechanical, almost like he was working. I squinted, trying to get a better look, and that's when he looked up. It felt like almost a punch to the gut. He was now staring directly at me. He didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me. He just stood there, watching for a long moment before turning back to whatever he was doing. I found myself waving anyway, because what else do you do when somebody's staring at you from a distance? I thought maybe he was just curious, like I was, but he didn't wave back. He just carried on. So I turned back to my work, but the unease lingered. I hadn't expected to see another soul all the way out here. I figured that cabin was empty, a ghost from the past, but that man's gaze, it stuck with me. Something about it was just very strange. I shook it off though, moved forward, working my way down the ridge towards the bottom of the slope. I planned on taking a few samples near the base, see what the hill pushed out, but now with the cabin so close, it felt almost inevitable that I had to investigate it. I mean, I've come this far after all. As I got closer though, the feeling that something wasn't quite right now settled over me. The man still hadn't moved and hadn't seemed to care about my presence at all, but that didn't make sense to me either. Out here, anybody who saw another person would immediately make contact, even if it was just to make sure they weren't a threat. Yet, this man hadn't even flinched when I waved at him. I didn't realize just how much that bothered me until I felt the first crack, sharp and sudden, slicing through the air like a knife. I froze. The ground at my feet exploded. Dirt and rocks flew around me, pelting from all sides. My heart leapt in my throat. I instinctively ducked behind a boulder, my breath freezing in my lungs. My hand scrambled for cover as I pressed myself low to the ground. Overhead, bullets continued to whiz by, exploding in the rocks. That man had a gun. I didn't see it at first. I couldn't see it from that distance, but now it was evidently clear. He'd taken a knee beside the cabin, steadying himself with the rifle aimed directly at me. Crack, 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 crack. He had a feather finger on that trigger, and clearly he wanted to kill me. The shots would come in fast, each one zipping through the air like thunder, the impact of dirt and rocks sending vibrations up through the soles of my boots. I couldn't move, I couldn't risk it. That boulder was my only protection, so I waited. The gunfire then stopped, but the silence that followed it was almost worse. I stayed pressed to the ground, mind racing, trying to figure out what should I do next. My phone was dead, I couldn't get a call back on the radio, and there was no way to make any kind of contact and get help all the way out here. I listened for any sound, the faintest movement, anything that could tell me where this man was now, but all I could hear was the wind, the distant call of a hawk, and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Minutes passed by, maybe even longer, I'm not sure. Eventually, I realized that I had to make some kind of choice here. I could sit here and wait for whatever might happen next, or I could take a chance, head back up the ridge toward my truck. I peered over the boulder. Nothing. I tightened up the straps on my pack and scanned the area. My eyes kept darting back towards that cabin, expecting to see the man's figure reappearing, rifle aimed at me. But that cabin remained still, and the air was now thick with tension. I made my decision. It was time to get the hell out of here. I dug my boots into the dirt and lunged forward on the slope. My legs burned and my pack pulled at my shoulders, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I knew I had to get back to the truck. If I could just make it over the ridge, I'd have a clean shot at the 3-mile valley. Then another mile or so back to my vehicle. I just need to get up there before he spots me again. Halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath, crouching low and scanning the landscape. My ears strained for any movement, any sign that he was still coming after me. The wind howled through the ravine below, and the rocks scraped on their descent down the slope, but I didn't see anybody. You would think that would have calmed me, but it didn't. I was alone, but not really. This guy could literally be anywhere. I swallowed as my mouth was dry as sandpaper and took another step. That's when he appeared out of thin air. One second I'm alone, the next he's right there, stepping out from behind a rock just ahead of me, the rifle aimed at my chest. How'd he do it? He must have traversed like 300 yards in just a matter of minutes, all without me ever even seeing him. I skidded to a stop, heart slamming. This is it. This is how I die. Up close, he was wiry, sun-leathered, eyes milky around the edges. His hair was long and gray, tangled up in knots that hung past his shoulders. He had on these old denim coveralls, no shirt underneath, and the fabric threadbare at the seams. His boots looked really ancient, cracked leather flaking away at the toes. I raised my hand slowly. "I'm just a geologist," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't mean you any harm." His lips cracked into something that wasn't quite a smile, his hands veined and strong. didn't even waver on the rifle. "Geologist, huh?" His voice was rough, like gravel scraping metal. "The hell you doing out here?" I gestured toward my pack. Survey work, just looking at mineral deposits. That's all I'm doing." He stared at me for a long moment, those cloudy eyes narrowing. Then, to my complete shock, he exhaled sharply and lowered the gun. "Thought you were a pronghorn." I blinked. "What?" He stretched his jaw. "My eyes ain't what they used to be. Didn't have my glasses. Thought you was something else." A beat of silence. The absurdity of it all hit me at once. This guy had just tried to kill me, and his excuse was his bad eyesight? I forced myself to breathe and forced myself not to react. "All right," I said cautiously. "Well, I'm just gonna head back up the ridge." The old man just shook his head. "Said minerals, right?" I hesitated. "Yes." His expression softened just slightly. "Ain't much left out here worth finding," he muttered, then nodded toward the valley below. "But if you're looking for something shiny, there's an old deposit about a mile that way. My daddy used to dig around there when I was a boy. Might be what you're after." I hesitated, unsure if this was some kind of trick, but there was no menace in his face now, just a strange, distant sadness, like he wasn't quite in the present anymore. Thank you," I said, inching backward. He gave me a small nod, then turned without another word and trudged back toward the cabin. I watched him go, every instinct telling me to run now, to bolt up that ridge as fast as my legs could carry me, but I forced myself to move slowly, carefully, only picking up the pace once I was sure that he was out of my sight. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. That should have been the end of it. I should have just left it alone and chalked it up as a brush with some isolated old-timer and gone on with my life. But something about that whole encounter just continued to gnaw at me. When I got back, I did some digging of my own. I checked survey maps and old census records, anything I could find about that stretch of land. And what do you know, I found something. There was indeed a homestead out there once, built in the late 1800s by a man named Elias Warner. He had a wife and 3 kids. Tried to work the land, but the soil was far too poor. He struggled for years before vanishing without a trace. The last recorded mention of the family was in 1912, when a passing prospector claimed to have seen their cabin still standing, but abandoned. No sign of the Warners. No graves, no records of them moving away, just gone. That cabin should not have still been there, and neither should he. I went back a month later on an official survey. The cabin was still standing, its roof sagging further. The front door was now hanging open though. But no sign of the old man, no footprints, but I did find some tools and rifle casings, even some half-filled jugs of rainwater. I still didn't stick around and wait for him. All I needed to see was the homestead, just to make sure that I wasn't crazy. Some people are drawn to cities, to bright lights and the hum of traffic, but not me. City life is just a repellent, honestly. For as long as I can remember, I've been drawn to places where the map turns vague, where trails would disappear, and the land belongs to nobody. My brother Kevin felt the same way, and every year, we'd carve out some time from our lives to lose ourselves out in the wilderness, tackling long-distance hikes that most people wouldn't even consider. We'd done sections of the Appalachian Trail, the Arizona Trail, nearly everything in California. The more remote, the better. We liked being cut off from the world, miles from the nearest road, where the only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the wind throughout the trees. We also liked doing those historical trails, places where we could learn about American travelers of the past. But on this year, and in this story, we pushed it a lot further than we normally did. Northern California near the Oregon border. Miles and miles of nothing. No well-marked trails, no ranger stations, just backcountry and a handful of game trails cutting through the dense forest. It was exactly what we were looking for. Something new, a challenge, something to make or break us. We mapped our route pretty carefully, planning to start from the unmaintained trailhead and work our way deep into the hills, navigating by compass and pure instinct. We'd be out for a couple of days, one night, self-sufficient, and carrying everything we needed directly on our backs. It started out pretty much just like any other hike that we'd taken before. The air was nice and crisp, carrying that damp scent of pine and earth. The first few miles were steep. Our legs were burning as we climbed up the ridge, but the view at the top was well worth it. Rolling hills of green, untouched, stretching as far as the eye could see. We stood there catching our breath, sipping water and just taking in the view. We could see the actual trail system sprawling out in the other direction. We were just bushwhacking our way up a slope until we hit the top. "Middle of nowhere," Kevin said, grinning. "That's the way I like it." I nodded, scanning the tree line ahead. Not even a power line in sight. We should have known then that things were too perfect. We should have seen the signs, especially with the era that this happened in. But we didn't. We just kept walking. The descent into the trees was pretty slow going. That slope was steep, and the ground was very uneven, littered with loose rocks and dry crumbling leaves. The deeper we went, the more the light struggled to get through the canopy. The towering pines and tangled undergrowth cast everything inside this dull green haze. Kevin led the way, moving with confidence of somebody who had spent half his life picking his way through landscapes just like this. I followed close behind him, keeping my eye on our surroundings, half listening to the birds and the rustling branches. I really liked knowing what was moving around me. Out here, every sound meant something. We were making pretty good time at first, covering a few more miles without much trouble. Then I took a step forward and the world exploded. A deafening crack split the air, followed by a blast of dirt and debris at my feet. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance, heart on the verge of exploding. "Damn, dude, are you all right?" Kevin barked, already scrambling over to me. I stared at the ground, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The smell of gunpowder filled my nose. Scattered at my feet were fragments of rusted metal and splintered plastic. What was left of a cheap wooden mousetrap, its broken pieces mixed with bent remnants of a shotgun shell. A goddamn booby trap. Kevin crouched down and picked up a piece of the shattered trap. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "Some kids screwing around?" I shook my head, still catching my breath. Kids don't hike 10 miles into the wilderness just to set up some kind of prank like this. Kevin frowned, tossing the debris aside. Still, if that was meant to kill somebody, it did a pretty shitty job. I didn't laugh because if there was one, there had to be more. After that, we started moving a lot more carefully, eyes scanning the forest floor for anything that was out of place. Sure enough, 100 yards in, Kevin spotted another one. Wire strung low between two saplings, rigged to a similar contraption. We stepped around it, suddenly hyper aware of every step that we were taking. That's when we saw something else, and at first it was just one, an odd stretch of metal pipes poking out of the ground, unnatural against the forest floor. And then we saw another, and another. Water lines. I stopped, exchanging a glance with Kevin. He was sniffing at the air. "Do you smell that?" I took a breath and the sharp, pungent scent hit me almost immediately. Skunky. Not the kind of smell you associate with an animal either. "Oh shit," Kevin whispered. "We need to go." I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw the canopy. At first it blended in, this thick mesh of branches and tarps, layered so heavily that it looked like a part of the forest itself, but beneath it, in the dim light, rows of plants stretched out in this organized line. Thick green stalks, sticky leaves, marijuana. And I'm talking a lot of it. We'd walked straight into a grow operation. And wouldn't you know it, they weren't alone. Up on the ridge, there was a man stood, watching. I barely breathed, afraid to even blink. He was maybe 50 yards away with a rifle slung across his chest. His stance was relaxed but intentional. He was not a hiker, and he was not a hunter. He was guarding. Kevin then barely moved, his voice barely even audible. "Let's get the hell out of here, now." I nodded back slowly. Any sudden movements might draw attention. The last thing I want to do right now is look like a threat. Quietly and carefully, we turned and retraced our steps, avoiding those booby traps and moving as soundlessly as we could. Somehow, the guard up top hadn't seen us make our way down, and we wanted to keep it that way. One misstep and the top of my head might just pop off. Every step after that felt like a total risk. Even the trees felt thinner now. The forest was now more open, exposing us. I fought that instinct to run, forcing myself to move at this steady pace, keeping my breath low and even. We just need to make it back up the ridge, back towards the trailhead. We were nearly at the tree line when shouting started. Spanish, fast and panicked. Kevin grabbed my arm, eyes wide. "Shit, did they see us?" I didn't answer, just ushered him forward and kept my ass moving. And then came the gunfire. The cracks echoed off through the trees, and that was it. Our instincts took over. We ran. I don't know even if they were really shooting at us, but the sound was all I needed to start pumping my knees and elbows. Branches whipped at my face, thorns clawed at my arms. My backpack bounced against my shoulders as I sprinted forward. That uneven ground, treacherous. Behind me, Kevin was cursing, his breath ragged. We weren't being chased, at least not yet, but those shots had us on edge and made us think that we were. And then, out of nowhere, pain. Blinding, searing pain. It felt like I'd been shot or stung by 1,000 wasps. All I knew was that something bad was happening to me. I barely had time to react before my whole body jerked backward, my face and arms burning like they'd been set on fire. Kevin let out a sharp cry beside me. We walked straight into something, nearly invisible into the fading light. Fishing lines. They were strung between the trees, dozens of strands, and hooked along each one, barbed fishing hooks, suspended at face level. I let out this strangled sound, and my hands flew to my face. 10, maybe 20 hooks had caught me, in my chin, my neck, the soft flesh of my armpit, and the sting was immediate, white hot. My vision was swimming. Kevin seemed to have gotten it worse. I turned as my breath was catching. Hooks pierced his arms, his throat. One even caught in his lower eyelid. He was gasping out, hands shaking as he tried to yank them free. Panic was surging through me. "Don't pull! Do not pull!" I started, but he was already ripping them out, blood welling from the punctures. I gritted my teeth and did the same. The pain was instant, hot and wet, spreading down my skin. My fingers trembled, yanking the last hook free in my arm. We did not have time to dwell on this. Those voices were getting closer, and so was that gunfire. With everything we had left, we pushed forward, crashing through the undergrowth, running blindly. At this point, the terrain began to slope down, so we just let gravity do its job. There were points where we were falling ass over elbows just to get to the bottom. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Didn't even register the pain anymore. The shouting faded, and we didn't stop until we physically couldn't anymore. 3 miles. That's how far we ran before our bodies completely gave out, before we collapsed under the cold earth, lungs screaming out for air. We just laid there for what felt like an hour, chest still heaving, the ground cool against our sweat-drenched skin. The world was now eerily silent. No more shouting or gunshots. No movement except the trees. The pain from the hooks was really starting to set in now, this deep throbbing ache between the adrenaline. Kevin was the first one to say something. "I think we're clear." His voice was hoarse, barely even above a whisper. Blood was running out of his wounds in every direction. I turned my head to look at him. even in this now dimming light, I could see the dark streaks of it across his arms and neck. My stomach twisted when I noticed that deep puncture just under his eye. Another half inch, and he might have lost it. "We need to get back to the truck, now," I said. My throat was raw, my body teetering on complete failure. "Before it gets dark, before we get caught out here in the dark, and if we do, you know we're dead." Kevin nodded, and we both knew nightfall out here meant a different kind of danger. Getting lost or hypothermia, maybe even the wildlife. But neither of us moved right away. Our bodies were spent, and fear had just left us drained, a complete husk of ourselves. The other thing scaring us, and we didn't even talk about it. I was scared for my brother, and I know he was scared for me. What would we do if one of us got gunned down or caught in another trap? Would I leave him? It was an awful thought that crossed my mind. Eventually, though, we forced ourselves back up, and the pain really hit full force then, the burning in our skin, but we pushed through. We didn't have any other option. We checked our maps, adjusted our packs, and started walking. Slowly at first, wincing with every single step. Then faster as the trees thinned, and the familiar ridgeline came into view. Honestly, the hike back to the truck was the longest 8 miles of my life. Every rustling branch made my heart hammer. Every shift in the wind felt like a whisper of something unseen just behind us. We kept expecting to hear voices, footsteps, anything that might signal they had followed us, but the forest remained dead quiet. No sign of trouble, no matter where we looked. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was near pitch black. The truck was right where we left it, a beacon inside this emptiness. We climbed inside and slammed the doors, locking them immediately. Only then did we slightly relax, even if it was just for a moment. Kevin wiped at the blood on his arms with the edge of his shirt. "We should report this." I nodded, but in the pit of my stomach, I was worried it might bring more trouble than it was worth. We made the call the next morning, gave the rangers the exact location, told them about the traps, the grow operation, the armed men. They took our statement and said they'd pass it along to the right authorities. 2 weeks later, that entire stretch of forest went up in flames. The official word? There wasn't one. It was weird. We really couldn't tell if the feds caught them and moved in and burned it all to the ground, or if maybe the growers became paranoid, decided to just do it themselves and vacate the area. Whatever the case, I still have scars from those damn fish hooks. I never actually met the guy, but I still think about him. It's strange, really. We've pulled plenty of people out of the woods, some cold, some hungry, some dead. Some we never find at all. But this one has stuck with me. Maybe it's because when we first got the call, it sounded fairly routine. When you work search and rescue, you experience a lot, and you hear about even more. This was just one of those missions like the others. A missing hiker inside a popular state park. Fairly easy, right? I got the text on a Sunday afternoon. Young guy, mid-30s, had been hiking with a buddy when he started feeling off. Now at the time they weren't super far from their car, maybe a mile and a half. But instead of pushing through, he sat down and asked his friend to go on ahead, grab his meds and then come back for him. When the friend returned, the guy was just gone, vanished. Again, at first I was not worried. The park had a mix of front country and back country trails, some leading deep into rugged terrain, but it wasn't like he disappeared in the middle of the Rockies. People got turned around all the time out here. 99% of them turned up within a few hours. A little embarrassed, sure, but fine. And that's exactly what I thought was about to happen again this time. I met up with the first wave of responders at the trailhead. A few volunteers, my unit coordinator, and some park rangers. The sun was low, The air was thick with the smell of pending rain across that valley. It was actually warm for early fall, the kind of weather that made perfect for hiking conditions, unless of course you get lost. His friend was waiting for us at the entrance, pacing and running a hand through his sweat-matted hair. He looked like he hadn't sat down since the guy actually went missing. And I felt for him. I'm sure he was feeling guilty. The truth of the matter was, this was another blameless situation. I was only gone maybe an hour, he kept saying. 2 tops. He was right there, right there. I nodded along, taking some mental notes. There's no reason to doubt him, at least not yet. We had zero reason to doubt this guy. We moved quickly, hasty searches at first, checking the high probability areas, places where lost hikers might logically end up. This guy had been on a marked trail, and a damn popular one at that. How you get so far off that path to get lost, I don't really know. Maybe he went to the bathroom and got injured. My mind was ripe with all kinds of possibilities. It didn't matter though. This guy was nowhere to be found. The sun continued to sink lower. My gut was starting to whisper that this was not going to be easy this time. Then, maybe 10 meters off the trail, I spotted something half buried in the leaves. A phone, and not just any phone, it was his. I waved the others over, my pulse jumping, and it didn't end up being just the phone. There's a bag and some other small items scattered nearby, some trash, a sock, even a protein bar wrapper. At first we thought, okay, great, we're close. But we weren't. We never were. We thought that was a good sign. Finding a subject's belongings usually meant they were really close by. Maybe he just wandered off to relieve himself or look for water. Maybe he gotten lightheaded, sat down somewhere else, disoriented, but still alive. And that's when we noticed something was wrong. The phone wasn't cracked or dirty, like it had been dropped in a panic. It had been placed there, like somebody was trying to get us to follow them. Scattered nearby, we found more. A plastic bag, a bent straw, small, insignificant things that didn't really look like much until you saw them all together. And now suddenly the situation was a lot different. Meth. I saw it click inside my unit coordinator's head at the same time it did in mine. We both worked enough cases to recognize all the signs. If this guy had indeed been using, it would explain a lot. Why he might have started behaving strangely. Meth can make you paranoid. Meth can make you run. And if you're jonesing for a hit, you'll say or do anything for a moment of privacy just to get high. And unfortunately, if you run deep enough into the woods, you don't always make it back out. Still, we were being hopeful, and we thought we'd find him soon. He really could not have gone that far. The sun dipped lower. The trees swallowed what little light was left. More units continued to arrive. Volunteers, mounted search teams, canine units. The rangers expanded the search perimeter, moving throughout the trees in coordinated sweeps. But still, nothing. We called out his name again, and again. Nothing. No broken branches, no footprints, no sounds beyond the usual rustling of wind and wildlife. It was literally like the earth had swallowed him whole. The coordinator and I talked a little bit with some of the other SAR members. We were trying to put together what he would need a bag and a straw for, what else it could be used as. We were drawing a blank, and when we inspected the bag again, it was clearly used to hold some kind of white powder, and the residue was, well, all over. By midnight, the temperature dropped, and I could see my own breath. In the dim beam of my headlamp, the darkness was now suffocating, thick and absolute. My heart had completely flipped. This dude was gone, and we weren't gonna find him. Somewhere off in the distance, a dog barked. One of the search canines. My pulse picked up. The handlers had been running scent trails off the guy's phone, looping through the woods in these wide arcs. Maybe the dogs had finally hit on something. I radioed in. Any contact? A pause, and then I got a response.
Negative.
I exhaled and rubbed my eyes. The dog had something, but clearly not him. A few hours later, one of the mounted units reported seeing movement on a ridgeline, a quick darting shadow just outside their search perimeter. They called out, and the figure didn't respond, and when they tried to close the distance, it vanished off into the trees. Now, it could have easily been an animal, a trick of the moonlight, but that wasn't really what spooked me. It was the way they described it. Fast, one of the riders said. Real fast, like he knew we were there and did not want to be found. A chill ran down my spine. Meth can certainly bring out the weirdest behaviors you'd ever hear about. We had a term for people like that, subjects who did not want to be rescued. It happens sometimes, especially with drug cases. The paranoia would just take full hold of them. They saw searchers as a threat instead of help. They'd hide, they'd run. In our uniforms, we probably honestly looked like police. And unfortunately, they'd die doing it. You dodge help for far too long in the wrong season, you'll be dead by morning. The second day passed off in a blur of dirt, sweat, and radio chatter. We covered miles and miles of terrain. More units continued to arrive. Even a helicopter buzzed over the low treetops, searching and sweeping the ground. We found nothing. By the third day, morale was definitely shifting. I don't get it, one of the park rangers muttered to me. He could not have just straight up disappeared. But that was exactly what was happening. The dogs lost the scent. The search perimeter stretched wider, covering acres of terrain that should have turned something up. A piece of clothing, a footprint, anything. But there was nothing. And the worst part, I was starting to think he was still out there. Not dead, at least not yet. Watching. And I couldn't shake that feeling. By the fourth night, I barely even slept. I just lay there at my tent at base camp, staring up at the nylon ceiling. I wasn't the only one either. Some of the other night shift volunteers swore they heard footsteps along the outer perimeter of camp. Others had reported strange noises in the trees, branches snapping, low muttering, just beyond the reach of their flashlights. One guy even claimed he heard somebody coughing over a hill, clearing their throat, hacking up something. It wasn't any of us. It was somebody literally out in the dark. By the fifth day, the search was now winding down, and we knew it couldn't go on much longer. There was still no sign of him, no more movement in the trees. Eventually, the higher-ups made the call. They'd put in enough man-hours. The odds of finding him alive were very slim now. Resources were needed elsewhere. They were pulling the operation. We packed up and loaded the gear, volunteers shaking their head, frustrated, muttering about how a simple search had turned into all of this. I just stood there by the trailhead, staring into the woods, gut twisted into knots. Somewhere out there, that guy was probably still running. A week passed, and then 2, and then a month. Still no sign of him. The park rangers kept the case open, but after a while, the searches were more for show than really anything else. Nobody expected to find him. Not after 5 days out there with no food, no shelter, and nighttime temperatures that could dip dangerously low. I could not shake the feeling that we weren't looking for a body though, so I kept in touch with some of the other searchers, and every now and again, one of them would send me a text. Still nothing. But weird things started to happen. The first month after the search had ended, a hiker came forward saying he'd been out in the backcountry trails and seen this man crouching behind a fallen tree, watching him. When they called out, he bolted off into the trees so fast he barely had time to process what they were really seeing. The description? Thin, pale, and dirty. Wearing the same clothes our guy had been wearing when he disappeared. So the rangers went out to check, but they didn't find anything. Then 2 months in, a camper at a remote site woke up to find their gear ransacked, not stolen, just moved around. The food was untouched, but their flashlight was missing. They reported it, and again, the description matched. A gaunt, hollow-eyed man, darting through the trees. There 1 second, gone the next, wearing jeans and a flannel. That was the last credible sighting though. Winter then came. If he'd been out there surviving off God knows what, that's probably when it all ended. And that's what I told myself, and I tried to believe it. But I will admit, sometimes when I'm in the field, I'll still catch myself looking over my shoulder. I think about those nights when we heard something moving just beyond our camp. I think about the riders who saw that figure on the ridgeline, how fast he was moving, and how determined he was to stay hidden. I wonder, how far did he go before the meth finally wore off? Did he even realize how lost he was? Or is he still out there, deep in the woods, nothing left of him but instincts and hunger, darting through the trees like a ghost himself? Whatever the case, I suspect it was a rude awakening when he came down from the drugs and realized what he'd done. His family is still looking for him,